the first place? Was there a moment? In psychology, there's a term that Howard Gardner uses called crystallizing moment, where you say, wow, this is it, this is me. Was there that sort of moment for you, or was it more of a steady progression of series of moments? And do you feel as though it was a calling?
We had opportunities to join the math team, and little girl, we had opportunity to learn how to program and go up to the high school and with the punch cards and program. I mean, it was incredibly exciting, and it may have been something about just the certainty of getting an answer and just something beautiful about it, and it may have been because I was around people like my father, who was such a cheerleader and so excited that one of his kids, it resonated with them. I don't know. And it was sort of physics later. Then it was so exciting that you could do something with it, to understand something, and it wasn't just playing games.
It was a lot like philosophy. It was about ideas. Mm-hmm. When you do it really fast, it's about ideas.
Right.
Yeah. I wouldn't have stayed in physics if it hadn't been for the experimental part, though, because then I realized that I could actually use my hands and drill things, and that's something our family had never done. It was all words.
I find that a lot of my friends, when they were young, were interested in things like fireworks and explosives and sort of doing stuff and making things happen and controlling things, if you like, in that way. I used to build rockets and electronics to control them and so on and so forth. That was tremendous fun, and in finding out how things worked, breaking clocks to find what happened inside them.
One of the tales that runs through inspiration, I would call erotic in the general sense, that we fall in love with our teachers, and that becomes a motivating force. So I don't underestimate Eros in the broad sense as getting someone into a field.
A lot of people do attribute their interest in whatever their final academic subject is, if they're academics, to a teacher or two, but you don't really know which is, what is the causality there, exactly.
Yeah, and it's
because, I know that at my school, we had perfectly good science teachers, we also had excellent modern language teachers. I could have done German, and why I chose one over the other was not because of the teachers.
In my case, it started really when I was about 3-4 years old. When my parents came from Vienna to Australia. They didn't know much English, and they thought it would be good if I learned English. So they basically hired a woman to take care of me, and she knew quite a bit of science, and she enthused me in science. Now, I can't answer the question, was I really open-minded and she poured the stuff into me, or did she chisel my mind open? I was too young to know.
In my case, it was not any of the stimuli that have been discussed. I was never interested, and I'm not interested in now, in puzzles and games and things of that sort. I understand the connections that similar types of mental activity are involved in solving these puzzles or understanding some difficult concept in physics. But I didn't start out that way, and it wasn't any teacher either. I don't really remember being inspired by any of the teachers I had at school. That doesn't mean they were bad, but maybe I have a bad memory. But I got into science through astronomy, and a lot of kids do, actually.
Yes, they do.
But I did have one older cousin who came to the US, and he was a professor of literature in Bloomington. And he, when he was still in London, 10 years older than me, introduced me to the wider world of culture, took me to films and took me to museums. We had the Great Exhibition of London in 1951, I remember. So that made me aware that there was a cultural world outside the rather miserable life at home. But it wasn't science. I mean, it was science. That came much, much, much later.
But the similarity in your story is motivating person again. It wasn't a teacher, it was a cousin, but motivating, strongly motivating.
But not for physics.
Doesn't matter, I don't think.
Intellectual.
Yeah.
But the idea of the intellectual life resonated very strongly with me. So that, maybe that's
motivated you to
maybe that's a common.
use your brain.
Yeah.
I've now sat through a bunch of these weekends, and I have a theory, so I'll tell you what it is. And
Please confirm it.
it is that there are naturals in different subjects. So in my own life, at the end of my undergraduate career, I was telling Melissa this last night, I had a choice between doing what I do in psychology, I had a fellowship to Magdalen to become an analytic philosopher, and I had an offer to become a professional bridge player. And the deciding thing really for me was analytic philosophy gave me headaches to kind of do it, and bridge gave me headaches to act it. But the cards just flew off my hands in psychology. So I was natural in psychology. So that's kind of my theory, and I guess I can't do it now after 6 months.
But if I may say, there's another point that you need to answer. Was that choice out of the three inbuilt in you when you were born? Was it due to your parents' interaction with you? Was it due to your teachers? Why is it? I mean, you did still play bridge and was very good at it. Why is it that you
Well, I think
made
I
those
had
decisions?
wonderful teachers in all three. And I'm not sure I can explain the notion of natural. So I found out in about 1958 when I took a humanities course that there was the life of the mind. I didn't know that. And I knew that's where I wanted to be. So that was part of being natural. And then I discovered rigorous psychology, and that fit my brain. But I wanted it to apply to people. And the only game in town was psychopathology and clinical things. So I did that for a long time, but it didn't really fit. And then I invented something called positive psychology, or was one of the inventors, which was about well-being. And that just fit perfectly. So my own comfort I've been choosing problems more and more appropriate, I want to say, to what my brain is.
I trained as a chemist because I had three good chemistry teachers. And so it makes me think, why didn't I stay in physics? And from what I've heard and from what I've seen so far, I suspect it is because I don't have that same delight in. It's not universal within physics, but so many physicists have a sort of sense of this idea of beauty and of something being that you can fit it into your brain, that you can that it makes sense to you, and there's a real sort of aesthetic delight to that. And I learned enough physics to be able to appreciate that, but I realise now that I didn't stay in it because I don't think that's what my brain does.
My own experience is, and I think I've known others who've shared this, is that different people are quick on very different timescales. There are some people who you give them a minute and they'll see a solution to a problem very quickly, but if you give someone a day, one person may be rather quicker than the other because their thought processes just work in different ways. And so, I think there's these timescale of seconds, minutes, hours, days, months, years, decades. Different people have very different speeds on those timescales.
Yeah. Well, an example that I always found fascinating, an extremely capable colleague of mine was hopeless on the short time scale. And when he gave seminars, if you asked him a question, he'd make a complete fool of himself. The next day, he'd blow you out of the water because he'd had time to think about it and give a good answer. In contrast to others who were terrific short time.
To a first approximation, really no one in this field has thrown out the notion of talent. The question is what it might mean. And one of Duckworth's insights is that talent is the rate at which you acquire skill. So the faster and the less input that will result in the skill, and skill improvement is what talent means. And that's close to what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm.
So, one thing I'm going to take away from this meeting, I'm going to try to operationalize this notion of natural. I don't mean to imply it's genetic. I don't know where it comes from, but I think it exists. And I think there are converging criteria about it.
But it's not the be-all and end-all, and it's not a sufficient condition for creativity, I would argue. So it might be a contributing factor. We're certainly not making the argument that's what made you all such creative physicists, was simply your rate at which you learned physics.
There is a distinction within what we've been discussing, which I've noticed over the years in some of my students, and also some very successful physicists. There are people who are immensely clever, and they're instantaneous in their responses, and they're very clever intellectual, but somehow they don't achieve very much. And there are other people who don't strike you as intellectually brilliant, but they have an ability which is that everything they do works. It's in gardening, it's called green fingers.
Yes.
Now, I don't understand that distinction, but I've noted it, and I'm sure, John, you've noted it too. So there's a difference between a brilliance on the surface, often a determination, and a quiet ability just to focus exactly right and get something that works. It's not clear how to conceptualize that.
Well,
You may know better.
An example of that is the ability to ask the right question, which is clearly important. I have lots of colleagues who are very capable, but they don't ask interesting questions. And I said to one who was a graduate student of mine, "Why don't you ask interesting questions? Let me give you some examples."
So I'm very worried about this natural idea. I hear you. I think when people are talking about what's natural, and maybe you could say, can you tell if someone else is a natural? It's very much to do with what has been in the past. And I think and I hate to say this just because I happen to be female, but for women it's different, because you don't even know whether it's natural because you're going into a very unnatural place. So you may say, yeah. So you could ask me, is it natural that I'm a physicist? And I would say no, because it seems a very odd, weird thing to do, and clearly it's not easy to fit in. I'm not, if I was with Mike Cates, and we were doing something together, he might think, you're not acting like the best natural colleagues I have. I have to tell you that most women and probably minorities come into physics and nobody feels a natural in that, even if they love math, like we all did. I could say that if I'm working on a problem, then I can usually solve the problem before I lose interest, which I think may be what you mean by natural.
I don't know, Melissa, if this was partly what you were suggesting, but certainly to me, it makes me uncomfortable too, because I wrote a book called Unnatural. That's the opposite.
Really?
And what I was saying was that, what I wanted to say was that they're morally laden terms. They're not neutral terms. I know what you mean by it, and I fully accept that people may well have innate different modes of thought, whatever that might mean, but I suspect that exists. But I think natural it's another of these words that is more complicated than we think, and we need to be careful about what goes along with it.
How do you judge for a prospective graduate student? How do you judge whether they're going to be a good scientist? Partly it's technical knowledge, and maybe you get them stuff. The main way you do it is you have a conversation with them on enough of a scientific topic that you can see if the sparks start to fly, or at least that's what I try to do. And that at the moment, that's better than any kind of metric thing that one can do. So what I have no idea though is whether you could design a test that had a degree of interaction in it in that way.
If you could measure creativity, what would you do with that result?
Well, everyone around this table does graduate students, and so imagine that you could better identify people who would go this is the individual level. Individuals would go on to make more creative contributions. I'm also attracted to the notion, are there environments and structures
Yes.
of departments that facilitate it in the non-individual sense?
The problems really arise when you're faced with very large numbers and you have to find some crude metric of how good these people are. For example, EPSRC, our grant-giving organization, would like to fund the most creative grants. Maybe, I'm not so sure, but I hope they would. And then you could give them a metric, because their assessment procedures do not allow for that very, very detailed conversation which you probably have before you take on a graduate student. So somehow we have to formalize that procedure which we go through when we talk to an individual.
Yes.
And how do you do that?
I think
You can say, what's the spectrum of creativity? You know, what's the probability distribution, if you like, and is there some way to influence that at departmental level, you know, by changing the style of the people you invite to give talks, or the way you invest your money in terms of support, of what level of research you support? Can you influence the spectrum of creativity? And that maybe takes into account the fact that it's a team game. It's very rare that people are creative in complete isolation, and we have universities for a very good reason, that we are a community and we work better as a community. So it probably is the case that if you went to a school of physics and said, we want you to run no seminars and we don't want you to talk to each other, I suspect the creativity would diminish.
So let me make a stab at a definition. Imagination in physics is generating connections with consequences, disciplined by the demands of technique and the external world.
How important is it that those consequences be proved experimentally valid? They be true.
Well, that's what I say, the restrictions imposed by the world.
Well, but I don't mean. Oh, yes, you know, they do need to be true. I'm not sure that they necessarily.
No.
Well,
That
seems not false, I think.
But it's about the word imagination.
Yeah.
It's not much use imagining something which is transparently false.
Well, exactly.
Putting something there which is not immediately false, and therefore suggests tests and hypotheses and so on.
Yeah.
That's imagination. Even if it turns out to be false later on.
That's what I
But
mean.
it can't be
Yeah.
false, you know, obvious.
No,
That's
absolutely.
not imagination.
It has to be part of a trajectory that connects with the past and may involve a large leap
Yeah.
from previous, the sort of canon of scientific literature before, but it must somehow connect to it.
I mean, people around this table, I'm sure, throughout the day, you're thinking at least half the time about some aspect of your science. And if you're not, then you're not going to be creative. Creativity is, I'm sure, hard work. It's not something you sort of have a night out with the boys, have a lot of drink, wake up in the morning, think, oh yeah, you know, I thought of this. It doesn't work like that. You have to work on it.
I want to amplify, reinforce that. And I'm not sure if this is default, but at age 19, I was on top of my daydreams, sexual fantasies, professional success. And I said, gee, what a waste of time. So I decided at age 19 to discipline my reverie.
My goodness.
So that all of my daydreaming was about philosophical and psychological issues.
Yeah.
And to this very day, it is. So, you know, I'm many hours a day, I think it's default network, replaying our conversations, turning them over and around, and it's about psychology.
I think you must be right, because the thing is that you're right that it takes this work, but I'm conscious that a lot of this work is going on in background when I'm not really thinking, not turning over the ideas, and I do find myself just imagining. You know, I'm working on some physical system, and I'm just imagining running movies in my head, thinking about what it would be like, what it ought to be doing, and so on. And you're doing this in this kind of semi-conscious way. It's not not focusing on that. It's sort of going around, and then some things pop out and say, oh, it has to be like that. But it's literally a movie running in my head.
Of what?
Of watching this system of things that have to do something, and particles whizzing around in a box, and then they do what they actually end up doing.
So
It's
just
visual.
particles.
It's
Yes,
visual.
It's like a kind of it's a simulation, a proto-simulation.
It's not equations.
No.
No, maybe that's the difference between physicists and mathematicians. That, like Mike, I always try to think in terms of translate my problem into a geometry. So even when I'm thinking of inverting a matrix, I think of a geometric operation, and our brains are so well tuned to handling visual information that if you can translate your idea into something which is visual, reformulate it like that, you have a lot of machinery up there.
So you come up with something like negative refractive index. Now, this is an incredible imaginative leap, at least from the outside. It seems amazing. But there's two ways you could imagine that happening. One is that, well, you have various sort of things going on in your head, and I'm going to explore this because it might lead somewhere interesting, and that's where it led. Or you can sort of see that target well ahead, and then figure out, my goodness, there's a way to get there. And I mean, that is an example. I'd be interested which of those two things it was like, from your point of view. Or maybe neither.
It's a two-step process, isn't it? You have to go through the imagining, and then after you've done that, you go through the editorial process and say, well, is this really right? And those are two different things, and I think it's very important not to have your mind in that censorious mode when you're trying to create something.
I'm currently interested in looking at the physics of Brownian motion as recruited by cellular processes. So you would think of Brownian motion as very noisy and therefore often deleterious atmosphere in which to convey information. Why would biology? How does biology overcome this noisiness, this thermal noisiness? Noise in the world, in physics and materials, in science, is not always deleterious. In fact, far from the contrary. The beautiful way in which structure and property emerges from noise and chaotic phenomena is vital to the world we live in. So the emergence of chaos and emergence of order and structure out of noisiness and chaos is my most surprising finding over and again. It's what interests me.
So when one thinks about the emergence from noise, how does one psychologically imagine emergence? What are the psychological processes in thinking about emergence from noise?
So I did think about this, and I can tell you how I thought about a way in which noise led to the emergence of signal processing. I fell into a sort of semi-reverie, and it was imagining a very visual, very concrete amount of a polymer folding into a protein. I had a sort of concrete idea of binding. So here's a big wobbling protein, and it's wobbling because of Brownian motion. And that's possibly the first difference between my mental picture of a protein and a molecular biologist's, because most biologists that I explain to about just how large the fluctuations are very surprised, because they've seen the protein database give them structure diagrams, and that there's the very words crystal structure don't admit to very much randomness, but in fact there is an awful lot. And then I saw this other molecule sticking to the side, and realised that as it stuck, it would stiffen. It would in general prevent as much fluctuation in that place of the protein as was going on before, and that because the protein is a connected mechanical object, its modes of motion are not localized. So if I bang this table now or there, I won't do it, but that glass over there will jump a little bit. So these are objects which are mechanically connected, and so that therefore the calming influence of binding something a moiety at this side of the protein will affect whether other places are fluctuating, seething with the waves of motion so directly or not, and will therefore there's some information at these other places on the protein that the first site is now occupied, and that the information that the first site is occupied is carried on top of the noise as a sort of carrier wave. So this was the story of the idea, and I saw the idea.
You saw it. You mean you had a movie running in your head?
Yeah.
This came up yesterday.
I had a movie.
Because sometimes you see things by a sort of having a debate with yourself. But you described that now, and I did yesterday. Sometimes you also just see things. Happy to, well, I'm imagining what should happen. It should be like this.
Tom, I'm trying to imagine the picture that you might have had in your head. Is there a mechanism of the stiffening, or is it just the stiffening occurs? Is there a mechanism, or?
Well, you're just adding constraints. You see, if I have think of a rubber jelly on the plate, and if I you don't put icing on jelly, do you? But I mean, this is true. But no, I know what I'm doing. Suppose I'm making a children's tea party, and I'm making a ridiculous confectionery which is going to over glucosylate my kids. I've got a jelly, but I've decided to stick chocolate biscuits on the side of it. Right? Every time I stick a chocolate biscuit on the side, embed it into the jelly. Chocolate biscuits are stiff. The little bit of jelly around where the biscuit is not going to wobble so much. That's the picture. It's not very, it's about that level of intelligence.
When you think about equations, are you thinking of pictures of equations? I mean, that is, do you see the equation as a visual thing, or is it? I'm sort of talking to the more mathematical people.
So I guess I think of it in terms of information in and what comes out. So it's a black box. It's a machine. I put something into this machine, and some information comes out. I tend to construct sequences of equations that way, but not all people do think in that way, and there's quite a difference of style, as people have said. So
what are the commonalities between the physicists? Can be very different, but are there some commonalities in the way we think, and how are these contrasted with the way, say, a psychologist would think? Is it what we think about, or is it the way we think that's different?
Well, I mean, I think that, as I said, the imagination is the easy bit. It's easy.
The easy bit.
The problem is to constrain this, and as is often given, it's like composing a fugue or a sonnet as compared to free form, of course, science fiction has lots of imagination, and indeed all the cranks who write letters have plenty of imagination. But the issue is to constrain the imagination within the framework of the existing edifice of knowledge, and that's the difficult thing.
Well, I'm not sure I agree, Martin, though. You said twice now imagination is the easy bit. Now, I know why you're saying it, but I don't want to take... I think I want to say more, but I do want to take it very critically.
Is hard.
But surely the thing is that you might think that you could just be completely unconstrain your imagination, and you just apply this filter of does it fit with? But you'll never get anywhere like that, and this is why the cranks are always wrong. The fact is, you have to imagine within the constraints is a contorted form of imagination, like imagining your way through a maze, and that isn't easy, I think.
I want to. Mike and I had a conversation after the meeting about so-called System 1 and System 2 thinking. This is Kahneman's way of distinguishing intuition, if you will, from deliberation. So kind of the crux of what Mike and I were talking about was as one becomes an expert, you develop shortcuts, heuristics, and you use System 1 intuitions which could be captured visually. And that heuristic really is quite important. It's easy by definition. System 1 is not an energetic system. And then much of the science is the deliberation that then fleshes out what would make sense of the image.
I think there's one thing missing from what we've been discussing about imagination, and it's words. If you try to explain your science to a lawyer, you'll probably do something like draw a picture or a graph. You'll be met with a blank stare. He wants it in words. And
the trouble we have with philosophers sometimes is
yes,
but
and words are absolutely central to the reasoning of people like lawyers and maybe other disciplines as well. And we don't use words so much. I think that's a big difference.
But when you say that you couldn't imagine a physics department without somewhere to draw pictures or equations which are pictures. That you share.
Yes.
One person draws the picture, the other person looks at the picture, and that's incredible.
Would you comment on Jones? What is the use of words in physics?
Hugely important. It's a big mixture. I mean, you're thinking sometimes in words, sometimes directly in equations. Well, I personally find that when I do need equations to think, then I need a piece of paper in front of me.
Yes.
And I'm pushing symbols around on the page and things fall into place. So there's this interaction between processing in your head and moving symbols around. But the verbal thing...
It's the reasoning, isn't it?
Yeah, most of us, when you're constructing an argument in your head, you are using words, right?
Yes.
It's an argument rather than a mathematical development.
So we use
As
the
an intuition
intuition
the words
to
matter.
fire the idea.
The right words.
And then we establish the truth of the idea with logic, which is constructed through words. That's the way I see my head working.
Well, I think this is partly influenced by the fact that also that in the end, at least, it must be words that you transfer the ideas either to other people.
Well, yeah, except that you do it at the blackboard as well.
Yeah,
and this is something which is a bit unique to maths and physics. A conversation between two physicists without a shared place to write things. Actually, you think, well, let's go and find somewhere where we can have a blackboard or that whiteboard.
I mean, in a sense, that's the way we're able to be rude to each other is to not associate what's written on the blackboard with the person themselves.
There have been studies of that very thing. That case has been made. I think possibly at CERN even that's the mechanism by which you can bypass these social niceties because it's out there.
Yeah.
It's not saying you're
abstract,
talking nonsense.
yeah.
It's saying this term here is nonsense. So I think it's very sort of well established in all sorts of spheres that it's a way of having an interaction that is too difficult to deal with.
I think I've got a hold of something from this conversation, which I didn't have before. So again, System 1, System 2 is a current language within psychology, where System 1 is intuition, low energy, heuristics, shortcuts. And so what I'm hearing is in imagination, we use System 1, and that has to be words and pictures. But those are they don't map well into System 2, which is deliberation, which has properties like contradiction and the like. Equations are part of System 2 and not System 1.
Well, no, I don't think that is what we're saying actually. I'm sorry, but I think that's a first pass, and I would describe that as a sort of first order term. If we were writing this logic, this discussion, that would be the first order term. But these two systems, I think all our comments could be summarized. These two systems are deeply, deeply related. And I find in discussions with colleagues, jumping from System 1 to System 2 all the time. So to take this conversation we've referred to is canonical conversation. There are 2 or 3 physicists and there's a mathematical equation on the board. There are probably little cartoons as well, by the way, around what the physical object is, and we've decided that this term is the noise and this term is the energetic thing, and here's a non-linear thing that's going to keep the whole thing finite from blowing up, and here's some that couples this variable with another variable in an interesting way. Okay, so we're talking about this, and then there'll be a little bit of formal stuff. Okay, does that make sense? Does it really? And then and then something in the system 2. Okay, let's write the next line down. Let's maybe take a Fourier transform and let's see whether this converges properly. That's a very system 2 thing, and then in the middle of the system 2 thing, oh my goodness, I never saw that. Up comes the system 1 bubble. So I don't think it's as clean as that.
I think with rapid cycling.
I think with the words, there's a narrative, and sometimes people use analogies which are stories, or have Tom's description of his jelly with biscuits, which I still have in my mind,
Party time.
was a story. He didn't draw a picture of that, but he described it so vividly that it meant something to me. But what physicists do quite a lot, and often very usefully, is try to think of one very apt word or one very apt description.
Yes,
and
exactly.
people do spend a lot of creative energy. So simply coming up with the term black hole conveys so much, so it sort of resonates in a way that
Metaphors are
it's a metaphor
huge.
that's tremendously important, and that unifies a sort of way of thinking that I
And it
think.
becomes everyone's
Yeah.
heuristic. So then you start
That's
with
right.
black
Yeah.
hole system 1.
Yeah.
It's interesting that it's often someone who has that real capacity for imagination who will see the value of those. They're kind of power words, really, and that to coin the right one can launch a field, can make a difference to a field.
It's the difference between dynamical systems and chaos.
Yes.
You say chaos, and it evokes something in people's minds, and it has a sort of poetry to it that maybe I think of maybe
Becomes
you
a
disagree with
meme.
that.
Yeah, it's the right pictures, but also the right notation, isn't it? Because you can have momentarily, one can be visualized more easily. So there are lots and lots of cases where simply having the right notation is an aid to thought.
Part of the idea of having a consistency of notation or a good notation is that it allows you to develop a heuristic way of thinking which involves some kind of informal manipulation of these sort of symbolic things in your head, which is heuristic. And so getting the right notation is, for me, I think there's something to do with from floundering around to expertise, which is to do with having the right heuristics and being able to think fast across a wide domain. And that transition, which maybe involves lots of people at once, but the notational thing is part of that. It's part of creating and the word black hole is part of that, creating a shortcut thing in your mind that allows you to do rapid, highly conceptual manipulations you need some substrate for that, which may need symbols. But if you have either the wrong or an incredibly complicated negation, it's never going to get out of system 2 and into system 1.
I think labels are very important here. I work in a subject called metamaterials, and we try to get some money out of the politicians. And I was having a conversation with my colleagues, and he said, I have a problem. He says that the politicians say you won't get anywhere with the word metamaterials. It doesn't excite people. And I thought, what? So what do we do? Think of another word.
So
but words are, and nanotechnology is another important thing. Everybody knows what that is, and you say that, and immediately you get a focus in their minds. So I think labels, ways of packaging things are very, very important, not just for ourselves, but for getting our product, if you like.
Black hole and nanotechnology
Yes.
both give you a
Wonderful words.
picture.
Yes.
So I'm going in a minute, but I'm taking something important away for me, which is greatly simplifying, and that is that imagination resides in System 1. It's medium words, pictures, stories, melodies, when I think about music. And then the question of communicating physics or the nuts and bolts of psychology is then to evoke in the reader System 1, to invoke the words, pictures, stories, melodies.
This is going to sound really geeky, but I had
You're in the right
a
place.
little chemistry, some experimental sets given to me when I was about 8 or 9 or something, and it was the word experiment on the side of it. Even though I became a theoretician, the idea of doing an experiment, I remember feeling a tingly feeling of the whole idea of doing an experiment and finding something out and making things happen. It was just similarly, things like that.
I'm really glad you said that. I mean, I feel like such a nerd too. Like the most exciting moments of my life are those when I have the feeling, like it's fringe consciousness. So the idea isn't fully in consciousness, and it's not that, and it's actually frustrating when I can't access it. But when it's like you feel like, oh, there's going to be something if I really work this out. To me, that's one of the most emotionally. Does anyone know that feeling that I'm talking about? It's like, well, there's a possibility there that there's going to be a discovery, and I can feel that it exists. It's pregnant. Yeah, so
it's like Winnie the Pooh saying, actually the best moment in the day is not actually breakfast. It's that moment just before breakfast when you're just about to eat it. And I think that's true of a scientific idea as well. It's just behind the corner, just hovering in front of you. You're pretty sure you're going to have the idea, but it's not there yet. That is quite a delicious moment.
Where does aesthetics come in?
Well, I think so where I now get that sort of aesthetic experience in science, so the emotional experience is for me linked with aesthetics, almost hand in hand. So it's very hard for me to divorce beauty and emotional response to beauty, including scientific ideas, certainly musical ideas, which I think we've touched on a rather parallel all the time. But a really wonderful scientific idea, I get this rising feeling of emotional appreciation.
So is the aesthetics the elegance of the idea? Are we when you say aesthetic?
I think it's an help here. I mean, well, I'll say a few words and then see people say, yes, no. It's not just elegance, it's a combination of profundity, simplicity, elegance, insight, surprise. It's all the same things that make a musical moment fabulous, actually. It's the combination of the expected and the unexpected. It's the harmonizing, it's the bringing together of otherwise loose ideas into a created and creative whole. It's the resolution of tension. Actually, the musical metaphor goes a heck of a long way here.
One thing that I think was interesting to everyone was when people described what that movie or what's going on in their mind when they're in their domain, when they're visualizing that. If you could describe as well as detailed as possible what that looks like to you. I mean, it was fascinating when Tom was talking about his, and I would actually like to go around.
Oh, it varies. Sometimes I'm asleep when it happens.
You're actually asleep.
Yeah, I mean, it's not unusual. A lot of people keep a notebook by the side of the bed, and they wake up and something is in their head, and it's called putting an idea to sleep. So you go to bed, worked on the problem all day, you're tired, but all the data is up there that you need to do what it is, and sometimes your brain sorts it out, and that happened with I had a very tricky problem in my PhD thesis, that there were some trajectories in the complex plane that Weinberg had postulated, and the sign of some derivative changed, and this trajectory was normally a loop. Everybody drew a loop for it, but I could suddenly it came to me in a dream, and I worked up the idea. What happened was that the loop twisted, and it was actually two loops, and this twisting meant that this change of sign was explained. It was just there in the morning.
But was it there as an image, or was it there as words?
No, I've been banging on about it for a few days, and all the facts there, and suddenly.
So you just woke up knowing the answer, as if you'd been told it.
Yeah.
Is that the experience?
As if I've been told it, yes.
Fascinating. Herbert, what's it like for you?
Well, I would say my thoughts are not very coherent or concentrated. I think they sort of go in and out of my mind, and I occasionally have pictures, occasionally have physical principles, occasionally have equations, and then suddenly an idea seems to come. And I would say suddenly the idea comes when I'm typically cycling to work or under the shower. But I was thinking of one experience, and since we've been telling anecdotes, I think it describes it well. I was asked to write a review paper on flows in over varying topographies, and I wrote, assuming that the flow remains attached, as zillions of people had written before. And then as I wrote it, I thought,
Hang on a minute.
yeah, hang on a minute. What are the conditions under which it remains attached? When does separation actually take place? And I thought about it for an hour or so, and then I went down to have tea and discussed it with a colleague of mine. And after having talked about it, we said, why don't we do an experiment and investigate it? It might be interesting to see what the experiment... It took us about 2 weeks, which we... talked about it in those 2 weeks and got really nowhere in general terms. And the experiment was then set up, and we went down one afternoon, and he said to me, are we ready? And I said, yeah, no, don't turn on the button. I know the answer. And he said, come on, Herbert, what the hell are you talking about? We've been talking about this for 2 weeks and you haven't said anything, and now suddenly, because I'm going to turn on the button to get the flow going, you know the answer? I said, yeah, I'll tell you, it's so-and-so and so-and-so. Well, it turned out to be correct. He didn't believe it. I didn't believe it. I couldn't understand. Where did that come from? And why did it come only in the last minute? Why?
I mean, that sort of insight would never have come about someone who's just a novice walking down the street. Right?
Well, since I have zero understanding, I can only tell you that's what happened. And I can't answer the question, why didn't it happen in my office immediately? Why did it happen just when he was going to turn on the switch? Is that irrelevant, the fact that it happened just when it turned on the switch? Did I not have a good enough shower that morning? I don't know.
What's really fascinating here is whatever goes on in the unconscious. And there's clearly extraordinary things going on, because this is not fairly canonical. We've been thinking about a problem and getting nowhere, in inverted commas, consciously getting nowhere. But then something below the level of consciousness is actually doing rather better than our conscious thinking is, without our knowing it. And then that's wearing on, and then at some later point that gets kicked upstairs again from the creative CPU, whatever it is. And that kicking upstairs can be triggered internally when it's ready, or externally by a moment. I mean,
it's been conjectured that we have thousands of half-baked ideas in our unconscious all the time. It's just all, and then what happens is, it's a Gestalt theories say that it's when our consciousness can identify it as a Gestalt is when that we have that eureka moment. So that's when it passes the threshold of consciousness, where our consciousness can interpret that as a whole sort of new idea.
But I think this is partly because, in some sense, I'm using the word no doubt incorrectly, it's a quantum of information. You can't just know a little bit to get to the solution. As in my case, suddenly it went from here to here. But now what you're saying is that it slowly built up in my brain and it went back. Unconscious level. Well, I didn't know about that. But it was only when it reached this level that the whole thing made sense and I could come out with it. My colleague was about to turn on the switch, and then I would have seen it in the experiment. So something inside me said,
like that,
say it first.
But then there's Poincaré's famous stepping on a bus, when he suddenly realised that, understood some lower class of functions he was working on. And so or walking down the street or in a shower, eventually. So it usually doesn't happen that way.
But I think the point is, stepping on a bus, you tend to do successfully when the bus is there. When do you have the idea? What makes the equivalent of the bus there?
Actually, there are loads of bus drivers. Roger Penrose tells the bus driver when I'm sure it's Roger who says the moment he realised that the singularity theorem could be proved was when he was stepping onto a bus.
It has something to do with a bus. No one's ever thought about that. Actually, the context of
and nuclear chain reaction.
Yes, stepping off the curb. Yeah, but similar.
Maybe the importance is this distracts you from focusing on a wrong solution, and as you move your focus away, it allows noise and other solutions to emerge into that space. I mentioned maybe to someone yesterday that Barnes Wallis, who was a great engineer in this country, he once described how he solved problems, and if he was confronted with a problem, he'd sweep everything off his desk and would try to solve the problem. without any background information. Just not prejudice his mind. And then, if he did solve the problem, or if he couldn't solve it, only then would he read what other people had done and the literature and so on. And the idea being that if he put these other things into his mind, they'd kind of block his own creative juices, because he would be thinking in the tram lines of people who hadn't solved the problem before. And maybe shifting your attention to the bus or whatever irrelevant object, or going to sleep, allows that bit of change to happen in that region of the brain that holds that problem. That can maybe, to use the Brownian analogy, diffuse about a bit into some other bit of this neural landscape that John was talking about.
We've been asking all these groups we're meeting with, what is the sacred cow in your field? The one universal value that you think stands above all other values?
Oh, that's easy, I think.
What do you think it is?
So, honesty.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow. I like that. So you didn't just say truth, you said honesty.
Oh, truth? No, truth. There's
Truth
no
is
hope.
slippery. Truth is far too slippery to hope for.
Far too what?
It's slippery.
Yeah.
I mean, it's there and it's important, but
Truth is
knows
a quality of an
what it is.
idea. Honesty is a quality of a person.
Our psychologists, they said truth, and they said they thought the Academy's commitment above all was to truth. And so we were curious, since this is the only other academic retreat we've had since then, where the Academy is still relevant, if you would feel the same way.
You wrote that in the briefing notes, actually. So,
Yeah,
we did
so
know
that's why I wasn't sure some of you
and
might
I
have
read that and I
remembered.
thought that's a very dangerous thing to. Obviously, that's a goal, but I don't know that it can be a value, because if we exalted it as a continuous value, we would never get anywhere. Particularly in physics, you have to suspend the immediate search for truth in order to make headway. Largely because most of what we do ends up being wrong sooner or later. Actually, there's something to be said. I came across the other day. There's something deeply misunderstood about the motto of the Royal Society in this regard, actually.
Okay.
So, nulla in verbo. It's almost always mistranslated. So our current translation for it is take nobody's word for it. And that's a really bad translation.
So what is the right one?
Well, I'll tell you what, the reason it's a bad translation is obvious. It's because scientists have to take each other's words for things all the time. If we all mistrusted each other, to the extent that we had to do everyone else's experiment and everyone else's recalculation, well, just imagine. So actually, totus in verbo is in that. What it means is we don't swallow tradition. We don't. The verbum is not other people's mind. It's the word of tradition. That's what it challenges, and this is really very important. But be prepared to challenge tradition. Tradition
don't take anybody's authority.
Don't take people's actually take no one's authority for it.
Yes.
That's a much better one.
Yeah.
It's the word of
Yes,
authority.
mere words are not enough.
Yeah.
That's also good. Yes. But the
Question
sense of
authority
authority is
is about
important to
to
capture.
Yes.
Question authority might be
Yes.
the new motto.
But isn't that another point, which goes like what Tom was saying, is that the issue of all of science is it's a sort of a global consensus, or aim for global
Very
consensus. It's the one that's truly global culture. And an important part of being a scientist is to think yourself as part of a global community and making collective advances.
But surely our subject is as no other, built on taking others' work and building on it as if it were true. And if we didn't do that, we would have to riddle our way right back to the beginning. And
Reinvent the wheel.
I think that's that for me. It was a step I took as an undergraduate. That when I was in the sixth form, I wanted to know why Pythagoras' theorem, why this, why that. Take me right back to the beginning. And by the time I got to the end of my third year as an undergraduate, I realized some things you just didn't have time to do that, particularly mathematics. For physicists take mathematics, a lot of mathematics is truth. You don't go questioning it and say, hey, otherwise you never get anywhere. So there are limits. I think it's true of work which is currently being debated, but and old truths can sometimes be overturned, but you're wasting your time if you're questioning everything.
successful, imaginative physicists have enormous passion for what they do. And when students come in, I'm thinking first year college students, there's a lot of nervousness about how to even find one's passion. So one of the I think important pieces of advice, and maybe this isn't just for first year, maybe this continues as they advance, but is to remain or to have an open-mindedness. One thing we do about where you'll find your ideas and where you'll find your passion, and I think that's really important. For students who maybe don't have enough experience understanding where scientists draw on their inspiration and the very circuitous paths that people take towards coming up with ideas or coming up with their obsessions.
It does seem to me that the increasingly education systems, within those systems, asking a question shows you don't know the answer, and that's dangerous. You're actually, it seems that students learn that they're there to answer questions, and if you ask a question, you're exposing your ignorance, and that seems just so harmful.
There is a long a long literature of the most creative scientists talking about the importance of questions, and I find myself actually my little sort of introduction to a PhD that I now find myself giving to undergraduates who've come to Durham to start PhDs is more to say, well, look, well done, you've done a fantastic job getting here, but you've essentially got here by being very, very good at finding the right answer. And I've got some very bad news for you, which is that this finely honed skill will from henceforth be almost useless to you. Almost, not quite, but almost useless. But what really will make you a successful researcher or not is whether you can formulate the creative question or not. Which is and I think that's why Einstein talked about the way he solved problems, as saying he would insist that he's not more particularly mathematically able than the next physicist. In fact, in many ways less. But that he would take a problem, and he said, look, if you gave me a problem and you gave me an hour to solve it, I would spend the first 55 minutes. The reason I might do better than other people is I would spend the first 55 minutes just asking questions about it and holding it and looking at it from different angles before actually trying any form of solution. And then I would leave the venture of the solution to the last 5 minutes. So I was keep probing and asking questions about it.
And also, along with these imaginative things that you advise them to do, I think the three important practical things, which are, first of all, anybody who's aspiring to genius must spend something like 10 years being very, very competent in doing the ordinary things. It applies to music. It also applies to physicists very much. And then another important thing for physicists, I think, is that you must learn to collaborate with people. Talking to people is very, very important. And the third thing I'd advise a student to do is to find a mentor who's going to take care of your career.
The bottom line is, with imagination, basically, you can't really teach it, but you can exemplify it and you can try to encourage it. But there's something that I read to graduate students. So when my new student, when I've had them, I don't think it happened with John, but I've often done it. Because to pick up another theme which you've raised and Martin have raised, there's this problem of timescales. Do you consider the present? Do you think of the future? Do you consider the past? And this is something which Maxwell wrote in his private diary when he was in his early 20s at this stage. So let me read it to you, because I read it often. He that would enjoy life and act with freedom must have the work of the day continually before his eyes. Not yesterday's work, lest he fall into despair, nor tomorrow's, lest he become a visionary. Not that which ends with the day, for that is a worldly work, nor yet that which only remains to eternity, for by that he cannot shape his actions. Happy is the man who can recognize in the work of today a connected portion of the work of eternity. Yes. The foundations of his confidence are unchangeable, for he has been made a partaker of infinity. He strenuously works out his daily enterprises, because the present is given to him for a possession. So that's what I read, to
Very
give
good.
people a focus that they should think of today, but get on with their calculations, but they should keep in mind the picture, the big picture. What are they aiming for?
Wonderful.
What's their dream?